Well, hello and welcome. Shall I go, Chris?
Yeah, Alex, are we recording then?
Yes, we are.
Okay, go ahead, Nadine.
Okay. Hello and welcome. My name is Nadine. I am an AARP volunteer in Juneau, and on behalf of AARP Alaska, I'd like to welcome you to the second in a 5-part fall harvest series with the Alaska Cooperative Extension Service. Today, Julie Castillo of the Cooperative Extension Service will be teaching us how to smoke fish at home. So thank you for joining us today. And before we begin, please take a look at how to use some technical information that we have. If you're not experienced with Zoom, your microphone should be on mute. You can tell it's on mute, and I can see everyone has done so. There's a red line through your microphone. We encourage you to turn your camera on if you are able. We recommend that during the program you change your view to speaker side by side, so you can do that up at the top right of your screen. Type your questions in the chat or raise your hand if you would like to ask your question out loud. It would be helpful for us if you could rename yourself if you aren't logged in with a name. You can do that by clicking on the 3 dots to the right of your name, and then you can rename yourself. And on another technical detail, we are recording this program, and we'll send out the recording and all the links from the chat after the program. AARP is a nonprofit, nonpartisan membership organization for people age 50 and over. We have 38 million members nationally and 77,000 members in Alaska. AARP's purpose is to empower people to choose how they live as they age, save for retirement, stay healthy and fit, build strong relationships, and have meaningful activity. And 4. AARP is working on issues on aging for Alaskans over the age of 50. We do this through advocacy, working on national issues like Social Security, Medicare, and prescription drugs. At the state level, we're advocating for telehealth, a sustainable state budget, senior grant programs, and healthcare. Education, brain health, technology use, veteran services, gardening, fraud prevention, caregiving resources, and financial planning. We have member engagement through social groups, movies, guest lectures, exercise groups, and many more. And community action. We have local teams in Juneau, Ketchikan, Anchorage, Mat-Su, and Fairbanks working to make their communities more age-friendly. Today, Julie Castillo of the Cooperative Extension Service is sharing how to smoke fish at home. This presentation will go through equipment, preparation, salting or brining, smoking, and other procedures in smoking fish at home. Julie will also cover the precautions that need to be taken to prepare safe, high-quality smoked fish, and she will discuss all of those things. The presentation will end with explaining how to store smoked fish, including how to catch it. Being raised on a dairy farm, Julie grew up preserving food from the home vegetable garden. From her degree in home economics, Julie continues sharing her learned knowledge of preserving fish and other food through the Cooperative Extension Service. Julie gives presentations and hands-on classes in food preservation, food safety, healthy eating, life skills, family economics, and healthy homes. She is based at the Mat-Su Copper River Valley District Office in Palmer. Thank you.
All right, everybody. It is time to start. Okay, can you guys take yours off? Thank you, Chris. You are on top of it.
Am I
So
off
while
now?
not quite. You're still there.
All right, almost done. Let's see.
all these challenges.
There it is. Okay.
Always
All
a
right.
challenge.
I got it.
All right. So we are going to start talking about smoking fish. Isn't that fun? How many of you, I'm really curious, although I will say from the beginning that we have a lot to go over. So if you have questions as we go, feel free to put them in chat. I'm not sure how that works with the Facebook connection, but if you do it that way. And then we'll wait with most of those questions until the very end. And note that we only have an hour, less than an hour left to go. Oh my, I hope I can get through it all that quickly. So it might take a little longer, but you know what? It's 11 and it'll be noon. You'll just have to start eating lunch and you're on mute, so that'll work for you, not for me. Right, we're talking about smoking fish. Almost any fish can be smoked. Keep in mind that fatty fish is really easier to brine and smoke. So fatty fish, that's things like salmon, black cod fall in that category. I will focus a lot on salmon because that's what we get a lot of fish on in Alaska. But there's also lean fish that we get in Alaska, such as graylings and halibuts. They are a little bit more difficult to smoke because they do not have all of that, they don't have as much of that fat. So the salt is absorbed really quickly because of that. So it's kind of easy to get the lean fish, or what I might call a white fish, too salty. So there are 5 steps, and if you were registered, Chris was sending out to you publications, 2 of our Cooperative Extension Service publications. The one that we're going to concentrate on through most of this is Smoking Fish at Home and the ways to do it for that prep. And then later on, we'll talk about the equipment that you might need for that smoking. We'll also talk very briefly at the end on if you choose to store it versus canning, what the differences are when you do it that way. Because most people that I know and talk to will do both steps. Some of them, they'll can some of them, but they won't. But some of them they will choose to eat immediately or freeze. And so those are slightly different steps in the whole process. So the first step we will look at is care in the field. We want to harvest our fish gently, and that also means cool them quickly. You have to fillet the fish before the rigor sets. Do not expect a smooth, tasty fillet if you attempt to fillet it during that rigor that happens to the fish. You also want to make sure that you clean the fish thoroughly and carefully and keep it very cool. Some people will bring in the fish by netting. Some will bring it in with an actual ability to fish with a pole. You're better than I am about that. Maybe you are doing it with oh my goodness, I can never think of the name of it. Names or words escape me. The wheel that is used to catch fish, if you have permission to do that in your area. And you might need to use a gaff. If you do use a gaff to bring the fish in, then gaff it in the belly, as there is less flesh to damage and lose with that gaff. So keep that in mind. Do kill your newly landed fish quickly. That's important because it helps prevent the bruising as the fish thrashes around. Stun the fish by a sharp blow to the top of the head. The heart is still pumping on that fish, but the fish isn't going to flop and bruise itself. So that also helps prevent the lactic acid buildup that's associated with the fish struggle. The stunning step also prevents the scale loss. Scale coverage, which is what is on the outside of the skin of the fish, that's essential to the manufacture of protective slime when the rigor mortis sets in. So complete scale coverage really makes for beautiful, shiny fish, and it's probably the best indicator of how well a fisherman has handled the fish. Do bleed the fish as soon as possible while the fish is alive. Do that by severing an artery between the heart and the gill, and this allows the fish to die a relaxed death and really removes the blood results in a cleaner flavor. Get your fish into ice before it goes into that rigor mortis. You know, rigor mortis means it gets stiff. Fish should be straight when they go into that rigor. Pre-rigor icing, meaning putting icing on it, ice on the fish, is the key step to supple, resilient, high quality fish, quite necessary in the smoking process. The cooling action of 2 pounds of ice is equal to 37 pounds of ice water, which is more effective than cooling it in the air. So in other words, pack your ice around the fish in a cooler rather than having ice blocks in the cooler, because the ice blocks are just chilling the air. They're not helping the fish as well. Contraction associated with that rigor mortis really causes tension in the muscle when it's attached to that rigid bone structure that the fish has. So filleting pre-rigor, before that rigor mortis sets in, really leaves the fillets free to contract, thus avoids the tension buildup that involves when gaping occurs. Gaping is the breaks between the muscle fibers and the connective tissue, and that causes those texture issues. Do remove the gills. So you're bleeding the fish first and then removing the gills. And that's to remove any of those spoilers. And it helps stop any enzyme action. They're a natural part of the life process, but after death, they stay to change the fresh flavors to stale flavors. So we really want to, they start to digest the fish itself. So bleed, clean, and cool the fish as soon as possible. When the skin of the fish is broken or punctured, then bacteria enter into the fish. So after the fish has been killed, the bacteria populations remain relatively stable during that pre-rigor and rigor. When the fish emerges from the rigor afterwards, then the bacteria populations grow, and depending, of course, on the temperature in which it's at. So when enzyme reactions, same thing, higher the temperature, the faster the bacteria increase. So the more bacteria, the faster the fish loses its freshness and the faster the fish spoils. So again, it's so important with making sure that you keep it in ice or in a very, what we would call a refrigerator temperature. You also want to remove the roe and the liver. Eat the roe fresh if you choose to do that. Do use a sharp fillet knife. Knives will dull quickly, so have a knife sharpener handy. My husband was very lucky. He got, and my daughter too, got a lot of fish a couple of weeks ago. They went down to the Kenai Peninsula because we were having some fish issues here in the Mat-Su Valley. But they got fish there, they brought it back. And he had to continually sharpen his knife as we were going through and filleting and cutting up all the fish that we'd gotten. If you do choose to eat the roe, it's best when it's fresh. There is another publication, and you'll notice behind me, it says cespubs.uaf.edu. If you didn't receive the publications that Chris sent out to you, then you can go to this site. This is where our Cooperative Extension Service publications are. And Smoking Fish at Home, put that in, you'll get that one. You can also get the home canning smoked fish. We'll talk about that a little later. But I mention that because they also have, there is a publication there on how to work with the roe if you want to enjoy that. If you're doing the liver, then you do need to smoke the liver if you choose to eat that. Cut the membranes on either side of the kidney that's still inside the gut of the fish, and use a blunt edge knife or a spoon. And to me, the spoon works the best to really scrape out the kidney inside that fish. And store the clean fish on ice to cool it as quickly as possible. You want to bring that fish down to 31 to 32 degrees Fahrenheit. If that's the case and you do it quickly and the weather is cool, it's good for 8 to 10 days. But it has been held at a higher temperature for any length of time. So if it's higher than that 32 degrees Fahrenheit, then this time frame decreases rapidly. So freeze or can your fish for longer storage. Now let's look at preparing that fish. So when you bring it home, freezing the fish is important. And that is if you are specifically planning on smoking your fish so that you can enjoy that smoked fish product. And the reason to do this is because of the parasites that are in the fish. So if you look at this publication, you're smoking fish at home, on page 2 toward the top, it is emphasizing that freezing the product in a home freezer, it takes several days to reach that 0 degrees throughout the entire fish. And we're talking 0 degrees Fahrenheit. The more food you put in the freezer at one time, the thicker the pieces of fish of the food are, the longer it's going to take to freeze the food. So if you've gotten a lot of fish at once and you're going to freeze it all at once, which you will have to do, then it's a good idea to borrow or rent additional freezer space so the fish can freeze at a reasonable period of time. Or when I was doing this the other day, making sure that I rearranged everything so I could put fish in different areas with already frozen things around them so that they would freeze more quickly. If you're going to do, so some of this is going to come in a little bit later when we talk about the hot smoked products or the cold smoked products, then if you're doing a hot smoked product, then you want to bring the internal temperature of the fish to at least 160 degrees Fahrenheit. That's important because it really helps reduce the amount, the bacteria that's inside it. And that's important also because you have to bring it up to 150 degrees to kill any parasites that are in that fish. So, and that's important, especially if you're doing the cold smoke process. So I wanted to bring that out. So you're bringing those fish that have been in the freezer for a long enough period of time. They've gotten to 0 degrees for several days because you're thinking you're going to cold smoke, or you're not sure if you're going to get it up to that warm enough temperature during the processing. So we want to now defrost our fish before we start smoking it. To do that defrosting, we want to do it in cold running water. So the water is on and the water is going to continually go over it to make sure that it stays cold. Another option is to defrost the fish in the refrigerator. We get slime on that fish. And remember, the slime has a benefit for the fish itself, but we don't want to eat the slime. I don't anyway. So if you choose to take the slime off or deslime that fish, then use it with a vinegar water solution. It's 2 tablespoons for each quart of water, and just use that to rinse it off. Some people, when I do it, and I have pretty good taste buds, I do not notice the taste of that vinegar on the fish. But there are a few people who have really good taste buds and they might notice that vinegar solution. So again, it's not something that you have to do, but it is helpful. Then you also may at this point want to descale the fish. And if you choose to descale the fish, again, you're using a spoon or the dull edge of the knife to get the scales off. Note that those scales fly everywhere. So do it in an area where maybe outside, which is my choice. If you do it in the house, in an area toward the sinks that you can clean more easily, as those scales stick everywhere. You want to cut your fish into pieces no more than 1 inch thick. And note the gaping in these fillets. This means that the fillets, when they were cut, when they were filleted, maybe it was a person who didn't have very much experience with doing that, so that no big deal. If you are going to, at the end, freeze them, whatever size you choose to do, and we'll look at another size shortly, is an option. If you're going to can them, make sure that when you cut those pieces, cut it to the size of your jar so that it fits. So for example, here we have hopefully you can see that if I'm holding it correctly in front of the video sort here, you can see that the fish was cut. This is a 1/2 pint jar, so it's cut to 1 inch below the top of the headspace And from the bottom, remember that you have to go at least 1/4 inch up here. So the pieces were only this big and they were cut to fit into this size jar that was being used. Now it's time to do brining or curing. For either method, you're going to use salt. So you want to use a pure salt, and that is a canning or pickling salt that you're going to use. It could be a dairy salt. It could be a kosher salt. Do check your label though, even on a kosher salt, because we want a salt that does not have any impurities, no impurities. Sea salt, table salt, because it has anti-caking agents or iodine in it. Those, like kosher salt, you have to check that recently. I noticed that several that I'd purchased had iodine in them. Don't want that when you're doing this because it might cause some smokiness or cloudiness, I should say, around the fish. So it's best not to use those. Rock salt, do not use rock salt. Or a water softener salt, oh my, no. Those are not pure salts that are good for eating. And they can also cause off flavors in the product that you're making with the brine. We do not recommend using, yes?
So this is Teresa Holt. I'm stepping in for Chris. I just want to clarify, so use salt without iodine.
Correct.
Okay.
Use a pure salt. That's what a pure salt stands for. Okay. So that's what a canning salt, a pickling salt, a dairy salt, those are all. A kosher salt maybe. But keep in mind that a kosher salt is more flaked than a canning salt or a dairy salt. So the consistency is a little different. So check your recipe and go online. This is an online source that is actually can be accurate, and figure out what the difference is between the kosher salt and the dairy salt. Because if your recipe calls for a dairy salt or I will say a canning salt or a pickling salt, those salts are more granulated, and they if they call for a cup of that and a cup of kosher salt, they do not weigh the same. So you need to figure out how they'll weigh and how they equal each other. Okay, does that help, Teresa?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So you're going to mix your seasoning with the brine, and that's what the salt is used for, but you can add other ingredients as well. Sugar, that's an addition that some people like. I do, but not everybody does. Sugar serves mostly to reduce the harshness of the salt in your cured smoked fish. The sugar also plays a role as a food for the flavor that produces the bacteria during the long curing process. And we're looking for a good bacteria, not a bad one in this process, the processing that we're going along with the brining. The equipment you need needs to be food safe, and it has to be able to hold the liquid for whichever type of cure you're going to use, either a wet cure or a dry cure. A wet would be the brine that you are creating for that to occur. A dry cure is just putting the salt on the outside of it, and we'll look at that in a minute. I think we have, oh, maybe we don't have a picture of that, but that's just layering the fish and the salt and the fish and the salt. And it's always the fish. So looking my hands, if you can see them, the back of my hands would be the skin part, and the front part is this flesh. So we're always going to put the salt down, and I will start with my skin down, my flesh up. I will put another layer of salt on, and it will be flesh and skin up. And then the next layer will be salt layered with salt, dry salt, and then the skin will go skin to skin, except there's salt in between, and the flesh is up. So another layer of salt on that, and then the flesh goes down, and then you cover it all with the salt. So that's the dry method. But you need containers that are going to hold your fish and hold the liquid inside, because that dry method is also, the salt is bringing the moisture out of the fish. Scales are also helpful. These are needed to measure the amounts of fish and also the ingredients used for the brining or the dry cure. Keep in mind, the recommendation is that the brine to fish ratio should be 3 parts of brine to 1 part of fish. So for example, maybe you have 10 pounds of fish. If that's the case, 3 to 1 means 10 pounds of fish will equal, so 10 pounds of fish would equal 30 pounds of brine. Get to do a little math with this processing. And 30 pounds of brine is about 4 gallons. Okay, so keep in mind 1 gallon of brine weighs about 8 pounds. Makes sense, right? Water, 1 pound, 8 pounds to a gallon of water. So that helps. When you're figuring out how much brine to create, again, find the amount of the cut fish that you are going to smoke. So brine recipes, and if you have this publication out or when you get it out, this is a basic brine that's talking about the heavy salt and the medium salt brines, and these are on the last page of this publication. The heavy salt brine is 4.5 cups of salt. Well, 4.5 cups of salt is about 2.5 pounds of salts, and you put that with 1 gallon of water. Maybe you want to add some sugar. Great. About 1.5 cups is generally what is added of sugar is what is added to the heavy salt brine. If you choose to not have that much salt, you can use a medium salt brine. That would be 2.5 cups of salt, which is about 2.5 pounds of it. And then you add that, put that in 1 gallon of water. And for this, then you might want to add sugar, maybe not, but you could. And that would be about 1 cup of sugar that you would add. And then of course, there are other types of spices that you may want to add in, and it's up to you. There's a lot of different flavorings that people want to try. Spices like bay leaves, pepper, mace, which is comes on the outside of a nutmeg. It's kind of wrapped around it. Allspice is a nice one to use. Cloves, juniper berries, kind of depends upon what you want, what you might want to try, what you have on hand. Those are just some options for what you might use in a brine. So to prepare the brine, slowly pour your salt into the water. Stir it constantly as you're doing that, and then chill it before using. So I like my water to be warm when I'm doing that because I really want my salt to dissolve in the water. And that's why, very important, of course, to chill that before you use it. The temperature when you're adding the salt has to be warm enough to add the salt. Once you chill it, you want it cold enough to, or warm enough to penetrate the flesh of the fish, but cold enough to prevent any decomposition of the fish. Okay, that's why you want it to be around 41 degrees or under 41 degrees, so between 32 and 41 degrees Fahrenheit, so that you can prevent that fish from decomposing. The resistance of different types of bacteria to salt really varies widely. One of that is the growth of salmonella. So that is inhibited by the salt concentration as low as 3%. However, we have another problem, and that's Staphylococcus, and those are able to survive at higher concentrations. So that's why we don't want overmuch, we don't want too little of the salt to happen. Sugars, pickling spices, add those to give extra flavors to the finished product. Vary them to suit your taste. Oh, here I went. And I turned off everything except my telephone. And I don't even know where it is. Oh, I found it. Great. Sorry about that. Actually, that sound was just to wake everybody up so you didn't go to sleep. See, there's always reasons for things. Okay, placing the fish with the brine in the fridge is a way to have it cold enough under that 41 degrees Fahrenheit to prevent any of the decomposition from happening on the fish while the fish is sitting in the brine. Maybe it's cold enough outside. Not quite yet, but I'm teasing. I'm cold in my office. All right, dry curing. And that's what I was talking about, involves packing in the salt and other compounds for periods of time. The salt, of course, inhibits the microorganisms by drawing the water out of the microbial cells through osmosis for the fish. For this, concentrations of salt up to 20% are required to kill most species of those unwanted bacteria. And again, remember, it's layers of salt and it's flesh between the flesh to flesh or the skin to skin as you're putting the dry curing, doing the dry curing method. So after you've left that sit in the brine for the recommended amount of time, and that will vary depending upon how much salt you have gathered to put in, then you will do, and I'm trying to see, generally it's an hour or longer that the fish is brined. Well, actually, it can be 20 minutes to 3 hours, and it really depends on the desired taste that you're doing. If you have a weaker brine, then you will need to have a longer time for soaking. So it really depends upon how you want that to work out, how much salt you're using, and how much time you have for this to all occur from when you've begun it. So generally 20 minutes to 3 hours. If the fish is brined for an hour or longer, then it needs to be freshened by soaking it in fresh water to really remove any of that excess brine. It usually takes 30 to 60 minutes for most products to do that. Okay, 30 to 60 minutes. If you use less brine, then another option is to just, so that would be a lightly salted product. You're brining it for less than an hour. Then you just use fresh water to rinse the brine off of the fish. Remember, you're removing any of that excess salt or excess brine from it. That brings us into drying and equilibration. So we need to dry the fish before we smoke it. This is important because it allows the salt to penetrate into the interior part of the fish. And it also helps it become more evenly distributed throughout that flesh of the fish. And that's what equilibration is. The surface of the fish dries to form a pellicle or a tough, shiny coat. And the pellicle seals in moisture, and it really makes the appearance of the finished product much better. Okay, so refrigerate while you're waiting for that salt penetration to occur. Again, that's to keep it under that 41 degrees Fahrenheit so that we don't have the decomposition going on. It may take from 2 to 24 hours, and this depends on the thickness of the fish. Usually you're going to be doing this drying time period from 6 to 8 hours if the fillet is 1 inch thick. Okay, so sometimes you might have a thicker fish. Maybe you like king and you got a king. Well, kings tend to be more thick. And so for those, when you have the thicker part of the flesh, you may want to cut them more narrow so that you have that 1 inch thick fillet to work with, so that it doesn't take too much longer than that. But if you prefer to let them brine, or excuse me, let them dry a little longer, that's fine. It's just an option. Forming a pellicle also requires a warmer temperature. So you've done that drying process in a cold area, 41 degrees or lower, and then you need to form a pellicle. And this requires a warmer temperature. It could be done in the smoker. So a friend of mine, and I'll show you some of his smoking, his ability, or well, I'll show you some of the things that he smoked in his smoker. But it really depends on where you choose to do it. But there has to be some good ventilation. So my preference is like this, setting it out on my kitchen counter when it's cool in the kitchen, but not too cool, not too hot. and put on a fan so that it ventilates across it. You want that wind or that blowing to go across. If you do it in your smoker prior to smoking, again, there has to be some way for ventilation to occur, a fan of some kind. And so this type, where you're forming the pellicle, this timing takes about 30 minutes to 3 hours. Again, it depends on the temperature and the humidity. If it's raining, it's more humid, so it is going to take longer for that to occur. Next step is smoking and cooling. When we're smoking the fish, we need to have something in which for that to happen. These could be purchased or they can be homemade. The heat source could be electric, could be propane, it could be wood. You do need to have a tile, you need to have concrete, you need to have a gravel spot, something to place your smoker on. And of course, we're doing this to prevent any fire from happening. You can use pellets or you can use chips, whatever, or you can purchase some, you can cut them on your own, whatever you prefer for the flavor that those chips or pellets are going to offer, or for what your particular type of smoker suggests that you use in that particular smoker. So homemade smoker example, here's another one. And again, note that this is on stone and it has concrete around it. Again, with the fire going inside, creating that smoke to happen, he wants to be as careful as possible. Then you need to have some racks. Well, this is one option. I'll show you the next option a couple slides more. Whatever you choose to use, when we're placing those fish that we have already brined and we've gone through the step of drying it and making sure that a pellicle occurs on top, then I want to oil my shelves, or I spray an oil on top of them so they don't stick, because otherwise that skin or flesh for sure will stick to those racks. Also, it's very helpful and important to have a tray on the bottom because that collects any of the drips that come through. So a foil covered one is what is shown here, and that's my preference because it's easier to clean up afterwards. All I have to do is take that tin foil off and throw it away. Lazy me? No way. Most smoke products have had no preservation step. There is not enough salt, smoke, or heat to preserve the product that is being made. So the potential for bacteria spoilage and botulism exists. So after the fish has been smoked, then you need to allow it to cool to room temperature. And cooling it to room temperature is important because that really prevents any condensation from happening inside or on the fish when you seal it. So that's why you bring it to room temperature, and then you wrap it and you refrigerate it. And of course, when we're refrigerating this finished smoked fish that we're ready to eat, we want to bring it to below 38 degrees Fahrenheit until it's eaten. Good things to use are a good plastic wrap or a good aluminum foil that you can close all the way around it. Those work really well. If it's like, usually our things are lightly salted and they're smoked. They can last for 10 to 14 days, stored in the refrigerator. And of course, the refrigerator, I'll say it again, needs to be at 41 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. So that's when you're going to be enjoying them after you've done them. And in fact, what I have with me are some that my friend Larry has shared with us to look at. And if you were here, you get to enjoy them with me, but we're doing this via Zoom. So you guys have to figure or make your own. Some of those that he's done, and they were in his refrigerator. And when I went over to get something entirely different, he handed them to me. So I thought, I'll show them to you. Another option is to wrap and freeze them. You can use the Mylar bags or the plastic vacuum sealed bags. Those are examples, and this is good examples. Place them in the freezer And that's wonderful because it's longer storage. If you've got lots of fish all at once, you may not be eating it within 10 to 14 days. So it's a good, or maybe you have some celebrations coming up that you want to keep them for. So make sure that you place them in the freezer right away. That will give you longer storage. So I mentioned that there's another way you may want to cut your fish, and that might be creating, leaving. So if you look to the middle picture, the fish, the fins, the end fins of the fish are still on, and this fish has been cut in half. So the bottom picture on the right side shows what it looks like in the inside, and it's kept together, and there's two aspects. So if you look at my fingers, those would be the fins of the end of the fish. And this is my arms then are showing where the fish was cut in the middle. The gut was taken out and removed, of course, and the backbone was removed, and it's cut. It could be cut smaller, which are the ones that are being shown on the picture to the left, where they have been cut and apart, or maybe part of this has been cut in smaller pieces and then it's hung over the rack. And this is an area that that is being shown is kind of like it's a smoking area that has a like a pavilion over it. So it has windows all the way around the edges, but those windows are covered, those open areas are covered with the netting because you want to allow the air to go through. Remember, we need some ventilation with that smoking going on, but we want to prevent any insects from coming in and putting maggots on the fish as it's being smoked. The smoke helps with that, but not entirely. So so in this particular building, then the center of it has the heat that provides the smoke to help remove some of those insects, and also to give us wonderful flavor as we're doing it. So you have options, but this is another method that could be used. And this was done with some people in the Mentasta area. You also, it's a good idea, well, if you have a way to control the temperature, you want to start at a low temperature and then gradually raise the temperature over 3 to 5 hours. So these are very helpful, and think about those as we go into the next one, because we want to start our smoking at a lower temperature, whatever that heat or the smoke is providing from what is creating the heat that's creating the smoke. And those little pellets, whatever you're choosing to use, will give it some flavor. Maybe they're apple chips from an apple tree, or mosquitoes that you've gotten. They don't grow here, but maybe you've purchased them at the store and you're using those because you like the flavor that they will give to the smoking of the fish. And that's fine. You want that to start at a really low temperature and go for whatever length of period that will give it time. You're not smoking entirely, but you're beginning to dry out that fish. And drying it at a lower temperature is important. Drying will, or the smoking will also help with that drying. You've done a lot of drying already, but it's not all the way through. And the reason I say that it has to be at a lower temperature is because if you started at a high temperature, what happens is that it pretty much bakes the outside edges and the interior stays moist. And that is not what we want when we're smoking fish and drying it for it to last longer. So you're starting it out at a low temperature, you're going on for the time frame that you want for that smoking to occur. But toward the end of it, then, and so if you look at this frame that I'm showing, about 6 hours in, that's when we may want to start gradually heating it up. And we're heating it a little bit so that we can get it up to that 160 degrees Fahrenheit. That's that peak temperature for it. And that 160 degrees Fahrenheit, remember, is very important. 150 kills the parasites. 160 is taking care of the bacteria, the bad bacteria that are inside that we do not want to consume. So if we can't do that in the smoking setting that we've chosen, then we might bring it to our oven. We want our oven to be very low. The oven elements or the elements in our smoker, those would be the heating elements. You only want them to come up to 200, maybe 225 degrees Fahrenheit for that time frame. And it takes time to bring them up. We're not immediately turning it up that high, but gradually turning it up so that for 30 minutes, the meat of the fish is at 160 degrees Fahrenheit. And then you gradually allow it to lower. So again, you're waiting 3. So let's look at the next slide. When we're doing our hot smoking, again, we want to make sure the internal temperature gets up to 160 degrees Fahrenheit for at least 30 minutes. And you're waiting for 3 to 5 hours before you get to the time period where you're going to raise it to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. If you are cold smoking it, that's where it's important to hold the fish, to freeze the fish at 0 degrees Fahrenheit for at least 2 weeks, because it takes time to get them that cold, and make sure the parasites are killed. And the internal temperature of the fish, if you're going to do the cold smoke, are only an internal temperature of less than 90 degrees Fahrenheit. If you choose to do the cold smoking, your humidity around it needs to be less than 75%. So check your humidity. Hopefully you have a humidity gauge at home that helps you figure that out. Keep in mind, if you're doing cold smoking, it takes longer. It may take 16 hours up to 7 days for that cold smoking to occur. So it's a thought, and it's different flavors, different textures. In fact, this one is a cold smoke, and this one was done in a hot smoke that Larry sent for us to look at and enjoy. And then he also did some kippers. And so this is an example of a kipper that he did, which is definitely a harder surface. And you can see that it's, well, I can feel it. Maybe you can see that or hear it clicking as I bent it, so that you can tell that it's definitely a drier product. The other ones are much more flexible. You can see that they have a lot of flexibility to them in that dehydrating. Note that I often leave the skin on, because for me, if I don't leave the skin on, it tends to fall apart, but you don't have to. Just note that you don't want it to stick to your racks if you're doing it. Or oops, I hit the wrong button. Sorry. This is the button I meant to hit. Notice that you don't want it to stick to the rack, and that's why you oiled that rack to begin with. But the skin helps too. Well, even when you use the skin, you want to oil it. Moisture loss in ready-to-eat smoked fish is generally 20 to 30%. Lightly smoked oily fish like black cod, Chinook salmon, which we mentioned, will seem very moist because they have a higher fat content. So a kitchen scale, remember several slides back, we talked about the importance of a kitchen scale. It also helps calculate the percentage loss to make sure that you have gone down 20 to 30%. Do compare the difference in weight of one piece of raw fish before you start doing this whole process, and then after smoking. So if you look at your publication, on it, and which page is it? I think it's at the top of, well, one of these pages in here. It will tell you the range. So when we are doing this, we want to make sure that it's 20 to 30% moisture is lost. So divide the weight loss by the beginning. So subtract the weight from the beginning weight. So the beginning weight and then the weight that you ended with, subtract that, divide that weight loss by the beginning weight, and then multiply 100. by 100 because that's calculating the percentage of that weight loss for you. Again, another math thing that you get to do. And then when you break it apart, you can see how the outside is more smoked, but during that smoking process, the smoke flavor develops inside the fish as well. Bones. When you are smoking fish, you may want to spend time taking the bones off. You can do it either before you smoke it or after you smoke it, but these bones are not safe to eat. So that is a thought as well for the importance of removing those bones. Or if you're going to leave them in and you're going to use these smoked fish for some reason, one of our favorite things is to make a dip with it. And we have to make sure and take all of those out. I think that a demonstration of another way to do it is how you cut it, and cutting it so that you can remove the bones easily is also helpful. Note that in the middle of this picture, we have one little dot, well, a couple of dots of white in the middle. Those are the pellicle. And that's what we want to not have happen, is that those little white dots. And that's why the pellicle is very important. And you can notice at the bottom and on the side, how the pellicle has formed and how kind of glossy looking it is. And that helps really get a nice product. So now that you've gone through all of those stages, how do you store it? Most smoked products have had no preservation step. We've already talked about that. There's not enough salt, smoke, or heat to preserve that product. So the potential for bacteria spoilage and botulism still happens. So after the fish has been smoked, again, we want it to cool to room temperature and wrap and refrigerate it below 38 degrees Fahrenheit for 10 to 14 days, or wrap and freeze it, as we talked about. The other option is smoking fish and then canning it. There are some different steps. So the second publication that was, or the additional publication that was sent to you, is home canning smoked fish and home smoking fish for canning. You're going through the same beginning steps in this product, but there are a couple of one difference is in the prepping, is that for salmon, you can remove that backbone and split it just like you did for the smoking process, but the other bones can remain. You can leave them in because you're going to can it. And during that whole canning process, it's going to reduce those bones in the smoked salmon in the jar that was done and completed and gone through that whole processing, so that we can consume them without worrying, and it gives us calcium. So it's a plus. If you're doing rockfish or flatfish, flatfish would be flounder, cod, sole, halibut. Those fillet them, and you do need to remove the bones for those. 2/3 pound of smoked fish fits in a pint jar. So this is a 1/2 pint jar. This would be about 1/3 pound of smoked fish. Keep in mind, to get that 2/3 pound of smoked fish that would go in a pint jar, takes about 1.5 to 3 pounds of the whole fish to begin with to get that 2/3 pound of smoked fish. And that's because you're removing the heavier bones, you're removing the guts, you're removing the fins from the fish. You may or may not choose to remove the skin. You want to use good quality firm fish and skin the fish if you choose. Cut the fish to fit vertically into that pint or 1/2 pint jars. Uniform thickness really helps the salt absorb more equally in the fish as you're doing it. And when you are going to soak these fish in the brine, if your pieces are very thin, if they're 1/2 inch or smaller thickness, it only needs to be soaked for 5 to 10 minutes. If they are thicker pieces, that means they're over 1/2 inch thick, then they should be soaked longer, 30 to 45 minutes. So that's the soaking part. Soaking in the brine is what we're talking about. Again, if less salt is used, then the brining time is not as long. When you are smoking these, you do not need to smoke them as long either. Generally, it's under 2 hours. You do need to can though, if you're doing with less salt to begin with, and you are not removing the bones. The smoking step, remember under 2 hours, you're going to make sure that you can them shortly after you do the smoking, because keep in mind, we are not smoking them long enough to go through all the steps that are necessary to prevent any of the bacteria from growing. And that's an important step in this one. So smoke what you're going to can and can it that same day. If you can't can, if you've done all this smoking in the morning and you've done more than you can that morning, that's fine. Make sure you can it that afternoon. Do it the same day. Most smoke products have not had that, well, we've already talked about this. So if you choose to can the salmon, then you're going to go through the same steps that you do when you're canning your smoked fish, but you're placing those pieces of salmon in the jar. So I'm taking my gloves off that I used to warm my hand because I have a jar here that has that smoked fish in. So my hands are going to get full of fish. This person likes to add a little piece of jalapeno. I think he really likes the flavoring of that. This is my friend Larry who's provided it. So you can see the size of the fish that he's smoked, and he's taken the skin off, and he's only smoking it for a short period of time. You can see that he hasn't taken the time to, a little bit of the pellicle is on it, and he's plugged these in. He's cut them so they fit into the jar, and he's been able to push them in and get them ready to do that smoking. And actually, if he was entering this in the fair, he would not win because it's should be 1 inch headspace from where the fish is to the top rim of the jar. Then you clean off the rim of the jar very carefully, very important whenever you're using fish, because the fish has that oil on it, even with the brine that it's gone through, and those can create problems for the seal to occur. And then we're going to add our cleaned lid to the top of the jar and our screw band. Again, when we're doing a screw band, we're putting it on till it catches, and I'm making sure that it's flat all the way around. It is. It caught, and then I'm going a 1/4 turn more. And now it's set, ready to go. So I can put it into my pressure canner that is on the stove, and the stove getting it ready to go. And it is best to always have clean jars to use, and preferably warmed up before you start. Although we're putting cold fish into that jar, cold room temperature fish into that jar, we want it to come up to heat as thoroughly and as quickly as possible. When you are canning fish, you want to use 10 pounds pressure if you're using a weighted gauge pressure canner, or 11 PSI, pounds pressure, and a dial gauge pressure canner. And I do urge you, if you use dial gauges, get it checked, that dial gauge checked once a year. Cooperative Extension Service does that as a free service. Do call us, whatever the one is in the community where you are, and make sure that we're available. We're in and out a lot. There's few of us and a lot to do. So make sure you know what's going on. If you're in the Mat-Su area, I'm doing it this afternoon and early tomorrow morning. So give us a call if you need that to happen, for your canning to be done at the correct temperature. Now, when you're doing smoked fish, it's 110 minutes. Those are for pint jars and half pint jars, okay? Both of them. Very necessary to do it for 110 minutes. What? Did I hear someone say, why so long? Why is that longer than raw fish? Think about it. It's sitting out in the air. There could be insects in it. There could be some of the other kinds of bacteria developing inside. So it needs to be, and also because it's a slightly drier product than a raw fish, it takes longer for the heat that's needed, that 240 degrees Fahrenheit that it is in the canner, to get to the interior part of every jar in that canner to the correct temperature for the correct amount of time to stop the botulism. So, and of course, make sure that you know when your canner, this is a weighted gauge canner. This happens to be a Presto canner. Miro canner has a similar one like this. It's a consistent sound like this for that entire processing time. Make sure you monitor it and make sure it stays at the correct temperature for that 110 minutes. If you are doing an all-American canner or maybe a Presto or an older Presto or an older Miro canner, it will be a round gauge with 5, 10, 15. That weighted gauge, it goes for a certain amount of time. It jiggles and then it pauses, and it jiggles and it pauses. And so read your manufacturer's directions to make sure you're doing it accurately. All right, so we have gone through the steps in smoking fish and briefly gone through the steps in canning fish and the differences. There's a little bit of difference in the smoking. So that's why there's 2 publications on that. And I hope that you all go home and have a chance to enjoy that fish that you have gotten and that you've smoked. And always welcome to call if you have further questions on these things. All right. Have a great day.
All
Teresa,
right.
anything else at the end?
Yeah, we're going to run a short poll. I'm just going to launch this poll real quick. We just want to know if people learned something new. Was this a good use of your time, and to rate the speaker? So we just ask if you go ahead and do that before you leave. It's easy to go ahead and just click on the buttons on the poll.
Okay.
Looks like we got most of the folks are answering the poll.
Were there any questions in the chat side?
There were no questions in the chat.
Good, that's because they already knew all this information.
Right. I'm gonna share my screen, hopefully. Are you seeing the PowerPoint now, Nadine?
Yes.
Okay.
So I'd like to thank everyone for participating in today's program. We hope you found this session helpful. Please let us know how you liked the program, and please put any ideas for us in the upcoming webinars in the chat. We would like to thank our partners at the Alaska Cooperative Extension Service for helping us host these events for you. And I am 7. If you found this session useful, you may sign up for other programs in our Fall Harvest series. You can find all of our events at www.aarp.org/AK. Thank
Anything
you.
else? All right. Thank everyone for joining us today. Join us next week for preserving herbs. Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Bye.